This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle here, the M50 version of the Sherman put together for the Israeli Defense Forces.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
Now, I'm going to take you back, first of all, 1948, Israel is formed as a sovereign nation. It's surrounded by Arab countries which really are not happy about the situation. And even before the British are leaving Israel, they've had the mandate to be in there to look after, try and keep things quiet. Things have been kicking off all the time. Britain is leaving already. Parts of what is going to become the Israeli military is sending out agents around the world to buy kit to put into Israeli service. And they're doing this against various arms embargoes because it's basically the worry is around the rest of the world is there's going to be more fuel to the flame if more weaponry is turning up into Israel. Now, the Israeli agents end up going as far afield as Italy, to the Philippines. They end up purchasing Sherman tanks from the Philippines. They get ex-US Fifth Army Shermans that have been demilled by the Italians. They get vehicles from a range of places, including the very first two Cromwell tanks. Before the British even leave, the very day they're going, two of these are actually driven by sympathetic British crewmen from 4RTR that are actually taken straight to the Israelis. Now, the Israelis are very keen to get armour because they know that those they are going to be fighting against have armour. And again, in this post-war period, armour is still seen to be the battlefield winner. So they're very keen to get their hands on various bits of tanks, and they like the idea of the Sherman because the Sherman is out there in vast numbers and there's spare parts, etc., and there's quite a number around the world. Two of their first Shermans they get are actually vehicles that have been dumped by the British that the Israeli military actually managed to recover and again put back together and put those into service. So the Cromwells, Shermans, they end up by 1949 about 50 tanks, mixed vehicles put together. They manage to buy some guns from the Swiss that they mount on the top of vehicles. They are happy to improvise and they pick up as well some ex-French R-35 tanks, etc., that have been left behind from the Vichy fighting in Syria, etc. So this very much a mixed bag, but the Israelis know they are going to need armoured firepower. And this is when they start going to France to talk to the French. The French are trying to tout their AMX-13 tank around the place, this lighter tank with the 75mm gun on. And in 1953, a visit to France, they are looking at the AMX-13. They do decide to buy it, but they don't like the levels of armour protection on the vehicle, but they do really like the gun. And that gun, the CN75-50, is basically a development by the French of the Panther 75mm gun from the Second World War. High velocity, about 1,000 meters a second, armour piercing. And you know, this is a powerful bit of kit, and the French nuance it to put on that AMX-13 tank. What the Israelis are interested in is when the French potentially say they can get it onto a Sherman turret. Now, this leads to a series of experiments in France before they're able to, some successful, some not so, before they're able to come back with a Sherman turret that they've been able to fit this M50 gun in. Hence, when the vehicle goes into service with the Israelis, they end up calling this the Sherman M50 because it's a Model 50 gun they've managed to squeeze into that turret there. 1954, for the first time, they're actually sending a version of this out to Israel, so the Israelis can have a look at it. March 1955, following year, they're looking at putting these into production. They have to put a counterweight at the back of the turret. Some of them have lead in to balance this longer 75mm gun so that the turret system still works. And for the first 50 vehicles, they end up using M4A4 tanks with the radial 975 petrol engine in the back. But one of the confusing parts of this story is basically they end up having to change the tanks because the weight goes up, and so they have to change again from, because of the poor off-road ability, change to HVSS suspension, so they're taking that from other vehicles and placing it on some of those first Shermans there and having to widen the track because of that. And that's one of those problems there, is that weight goes up, the original track width is just not being able to sustain that, and the earlier forms of suspension just aren't really good enough that way. By 1964, they've got about 300 of these upgrades M50 Shermans in Israeli Defence Services, and they're actually seen action almost right off the bat. 1956, they're seeing action in the Sinai. They go through these improvements, as we've been saying, and when you look at these tanks, because of their backgrounds, where they've been coming from at different times, there's a real mixed bag there underneath some of those Shermans. July 1956, why France, by the way, why they're actually helping the Israelis, they do something called Operation Golan, where they secretly deliver 100 Shermans and about 150 AMX-13 tanks are delivered overnight from landing craft to the Israelis, again breaking various arms embargoes to do this. They're keen to do that because basically France is backing Israel, because Israel is having disputes with Egypt. Egypt, under President Nasser, has been supporting rebels in Algeria, Algeria being a French colony. So that was the reason the French are actually really very keen to help support the Israelis that way. Now, this vehicle sees service into the 1970s, when it's then retired to secondary units. Other versions of the Super Sherman, the M51 version, has a new gun put on it, and that new gun is again another French gun that's being developed for the AMX-30 tank. It's a 105mm gun, it's much longer. They end up cutting it back. They take 1.5 meters off it to make it from its original L56 length to about a L44 length. Very powerful bit of kit, big muzzle brake on the end as well to help dissipate some of the blast there. And again, they're also vehicles that see action in the Six-Day War, 1973 Yom Kippur War. They're fighting against tanks like the T-62, and they are effective. These are guns that can penetrate the T-62's armour, and that's quite important. Early days, they were against things like T-34, 85s, later some Su-100s as well, taken into service by the Egyptian military. They're also looking at sometimes as well, even things like JS-3s that have been supplied to Egypt as well from the Soviet Union. But that's why they wanted to go for a bigger gun than the original 75mm on the M50, hence this 105 on the M51 tank. Now, these vehicles are retired from frontline service, 70s and 80s. Already, some of those earlier M51s, 75 of them are passed on to Lebanese. There's 4 Lebanese militia groups that are basically fighting, in essence, against the same enemies as Israel sees themselves fighting again. And in 1975, those 75s are handed over, and some of those see action immediately against the PLO. Again, this is across the border in the Lebanon and around Beirut. And this is one of those tanks, which is why it's got this blue paint scheme on it that was done by originally blue with black lines put on by some of the Lebanese militia and the Lebanese army in the south of Lebanon. They are using these, and this is a secondary scheme that they do, which is a different colour blue, and part of that was because of where they thought they were going to be fighting. This was going to be supposedly to blend it against blue backgrounds, blue skies, etc. Whether that really worked, we don't really know. But this vehicle, one of those ones, was imported to the UK some years ago. It's been restored by the museum at Eden Camp into running order. So it's in good order, and we've got it down here today. This is 2022, and we're going to be running it around at this year's Tank Fest event. So one of those interesting ones. These ones have been upgraded again. This particular one's got the V8 B1 Cummins turbocharged diesel engine in the back of it. So again, it's another one of those vehicles, and when you see them, depending on what period you're looking at when they're in service, they're going through almost continuous bits of upgrades and changes to them, depending on the nature of the original Sherman that this upgrade was built on in the first place. Some of these were actually sold on by Israel as well to Chile, so they saw extended service well into the early 2000s in Chile, ultimately being replaced by Leopard 1 tanks. So another part of that amazing Sherman story, how a tank that, you know, it's come to the end of its life in Europe as a tank being fought in the Second World War, but sees continuous service around the world for many decades to come afterwards. And one of those key areas that we haven't actually got represented in the Tank Museum is this bit about Israeli armour. So a vehicle like this, where it's gone for a major upgrade, the Israelis, very sensible, they realise getting hold of new tanks, it won't be that easy, especially with our embargoes that were in place at the time. So why not get a good basic vehicle, i.e. the Sherman, upgrade that, keep that firepower being progressively better, 75 then 105 guns, and it was very effective vehicle in action. So again, part of that lengthy story of the Sherman tank.